Welcome, everyone, ready to dive deep into something truly fascinating. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of cognitive science. We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide, and trust me, this one's a brain twister. We're talking how scientists from different fields, totally different fields, come together to understand this complex thing we call the mind. And get this, can we explain things like emotions and consciousness with the same scientific tools we use for logic and reasoning?
You're hitting on some of the core questions in the field. It's a really exciting area with so many different angles.
So, before we get lost in the thought labyrinth, let's define things. What exactly is cognitive science?
At its heart, it's the study of the mind and how it works, but it's not a solo act. It's like a team effort, bringing together philosophy, psychology, you've got AI, neuroscience, even linguistics and anthropology.
Whoa, that's a lot of disciplines. What's the advantage of having so many different perspectives?
Think about it like this. Each field brings its own unique tools to the table. So psychology might use experiments to see how people make decisions, right? But then neuroscience jumps in with brain imaging to see what's actually happening in the brain during that decision-making process. Putting it all together gives you a much clearer picture, much richer than any one field could provide on its own.
Okay, I'm starting to see the big picture. So how did cognitive science come to be? Was it like one big aha moment or more of a gradual evolution?
It's definitely been a journey. We can trace its roots way back, to those ancient Greek philosophers pondering the nature of knowledge. Fast forward to the 19th century, we see the rise of experimental psychology, bringing more rigorous methods to study the mind. But then, in the mid-20th century, things took an interesting turn. Behaviorism became the dominant school of thought.
Ah, yes, behaviorism. The idea that you could only study what you could observe, right? Like the mind was a black box you weren't allowed to open.
Exactly. And for a while, it was super influential, but, it just couldn't explain everything about how our minds really work.
So how did we break out of the behaviorism box?
The 1950s, that was a turning point. It was a time of incredible intellectual energy and some major breakthroughs that really laid the groundwork for cognitive science as we know it.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these breakthroughs.
Well, one key figure was George Miller, a psychologist. He was doing groundbreaking work on memory, how much information we can hold in our minds at once.
Yeah, I've heard of that, like the magic number 7, right?
Right, he found that we can only hold about 7 items in short-term memory. But the real breakthrough, the really important part, is that he discovered we can overcome this limitation by chunking information.
Chunking.
Chunking. So instead of remembering a random list of numbers, we group them, right? We chunk them, like with a phone number. Makes it much easier to remember.
Wow, that's actually pretty useful. I do that without even realizing it.
And while Miller was exploring memory, another field was emerging artificial intelligence.
AI, that's huge now. Was it that big back then?
Think of it like this. Pioneers like John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Alan Newell, and Herbert Simon, these guys were creating the very first computer programs that could actually solve problems.
So, like the great-grandparents of Siri and Alexa?
In a way, yes. They weren't sentient robots or anything, but they could do things no one thought a machine could do. They really challenged that behaviorist view that said we could only study observable behavior.
Right, because here were machines exhibiting something that looked a lot like thinking, even though you couldn't directly see the gears turning.
Exactly, and there was more. Around the same time, you have Noam Chomsky, a linguist, turning our understanding of language on its head. He argued that language wasn't just a learned habit, like behaviorism suggested. He said it was much deeper than that. He said we have innate mental structures, rules, that shape how we understand and use language.
So there's more to language than just stimulus and response. There's a whole mental system underlying it.
Exactly. And all of these developments, Miller, AI, Chomsky, they were converging. They pointed to this new understanding of the mind, one that focused on mental representations and processes, not just behavior.
So it was a true paradigm shift, like flipping the script on how we think about thinking itself.
Exactly. We went from focusing just on behavior to looking inside the black box, trying to understand how those mental representations work and how they're manipulated. That's the core of cognitive science.
Okay, I'm getting it. So we have this new field emerging, cognitive science, with all these different disciplines contributing. But here's the question. How do you actually study something as elusive as the mind? You can't exactly put it under a microscope, right?
You're hitting the nail on the head. That's the beauty of it. The answer lies in the incredible diversity of methods that each of these disciplines brings to the table. They each have their own way of tackling the problem.
All right, give me some examples. I'm dying to know how these methods actually work in practice.
Let's start with psychology. They love a good experiment, right? So they'll design these controlled experiments with people, testing different hypotheses about how we think. They might give people puzzles, have them memorize lists, or make them make decisions under pressure. The goal is to observe behavior, to see how people react in different situations, and then use that to infer what's going on in their minds.
So it's about observing the outward behavior to understand the hidden mental processes.
Exactly. And then you have AI researchers. They're taking a completely different approach. They're trying to build computational models that can actually simulate human cognitive abilities.
So like programs that can understand language or recognize objects.
Exactly. And it's not about building robots that think exactly like us. It's about understanding the fundamental principles of intelligence. Can we implement those principles in artificial systems? And in the process, we learn more about how our own minds might work.
So by building intelligent systems, they're also eliminating our own intelligence.
Precisely. Then you've got linguistics. They're all about language, right? But they go deep, analyzing the structure and meaning of language to understand the mental processes that allow us to communicate.
That's fascinating. So by studying the rules of language, we can learn something about the rules of thought?
Absolutely. It's all connected. Then there's neuroscience, which focuses on the brain itself. They use all sorts of techniques, like brain imaging, to see what parts of the brain light up when we perform different tasks.
So they're trying to bridge the gap between the physical stuff of the brain and the mental realm of thoughts and experiences.
Exactly. But it's not all about lab experiments and brain scans. You've also got anthropology, which reminds us that the mind doesn't exist in a vacuum. Anthropologists study how thinking varies across cultures.
Right, because different cultures might have different ways of thinking and approaching problems, right?
Exactly. And last but not least, you have philosophy. They're the ones tackling those really big questions like what is consciousness? And what does it mean to know something? Those fundamental questions that have been puzzling philosophers for centuries.
It's incredible how all these different fields, each with its own unique approach, come together in cognitive science.
It truly is a collaborative effort, and at the heart of it all lies a central idea that unites these diverse fields. That is the idea that the mind can be understood as a computational system.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. What does it actually mean to say that the mind is a computational system? Does that mean my brain is just a fancy computer?
It's more of an analogy than a literal equation. The idea is that we can understand mental processes in terms of representations, like data structures in a computer, and computations, like the algorithms that operate on those representations.
Okay, I think I'm following. You're saying that our thoughts, memories, perceptions, they're all represented in some way in our minds, and our brains perform operations on those representations.
You got it. Imagine you see a dog. In your mind, there's a representation of dog, right? Maybe it includes features like furry, four legs, barks. Your brain can then perform opputations on that representation. It can compare it to other representations like cat to see if it matches, or it can retrieve information associated with dogs like typical behavior or how a bark sounds.
That makes sense. But are there different types of mental representations? Not everything in our minds is a simple image or a list of features, right?
That's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes. Cognitive scientists have proposed all sorts of different types of mental representations. Some are propositional, like sentences in your head that express facts or beliefs. For example, the proposition, "the sky is blue," represents your belief about the color of the sky.
So like our minds are constantly generating these internal sentences to describe the world.
Exactly, and these propositions can be combined and manipulated to form even more complex thoughts and inferences.
This is blowing my mind. So we have these mental sentences, but what else?
We also have rules, which are kind of like if-then statements that specify relationships between concepts or actions. For example, the rule, "if it is raining, then I will take an umbrella," connects the concept of rain with the action of taking an umbrella.
Right, so rules help us make decisions and predict what's going to happen based on what we know.
Precisely. They give us a framework for reasoning and problem solving. And then there are concepts, which are like mental categories that group together similar things. So instead of remembering every single dog you've ever seen, you have this concept of dog that captures the essential features of dogs in general.
So it's like a mental shortcut, right? We don't have to store every single instance of something, just the general concept.
Exactly. And these concepts are organized into networks. It's not just a jumble of random concepts. For example, your concept of dog is probably linked to mammal, which is then linked to animal.
It's a whole system of interconnected ideas.
Exactly. And these relationships between concepts help us do all sorts of things. We can retrieve information more easily. We can make inferences. We can understand complex ideas. And of course, there are images.
Images, those are easy to grasp, like mental pictures we have in our heads.
Exactly. When you close your eyes and picture your childhood home, you're creating a mental image. And research suggests that we can manipulate these mental images in our minds, almost like we're manipulating real objects.
Like a built-in virtual reality system.
Right. We can mentally rotate an object, zoom in on details, even imagine it from different perspectives. And this ability is crucial for things like problem solving and creativity.
Okay, so we have propositions, rules, concepts, images. Anything else? I feel like there must be more to this mental toolkit.
There is. We also have analogies. Analogies are powerful. They let us understand new situations by relating them to things we already know.
I use analogies all the time. It's like saying this new concept is kind of like this other thing you already get.
Exactly. For example, if you're trying to wrap your head around the structure of an atom, you might use the analogy of the solar system. The nucleus is like the sun, and the electrons are like the planets orbiting around it.
Oh, I remember learning it that way. It makes it much easier to visualize.
That's the power of analogies. They help us bridge the gap between the known and the unknown. They give us a framework to understand complex ideas by relating them to something familiar.
It's like having a map to navigate unfamiliar territory.
Exactly, and we use analogies all over the place, from solving problems to making decisions, even in communication and creative thinking.
Wow, so our minds are constantly building and manipulating these representations, combining them in all sorts of ways to create our thoughts and beliefs and everything.
It's truly amazing, and as cognitive science continues to explore the nature of mental representations, we're getting a much deeper understanding of how the human mind really works. But there's one more important perspective to consider, that's connectionism.
Connectionism. Okay, that's a new one. What's that all about?
Connectionism challenges the idea that mental representations are just these separate symbols stored in our minds. It's a different way of thinking about how information is actually represented in the brain.
So it's not about individual symbols, it's about how they connect, like a network.
You got it. Connectionism emphasizes the role of interconnected networks in cognitive processing.
Interesting. And what do these networks look like? Are they like those neural networks we hear about in AI?
They are inspired by the brain, absolutely. Think about it. Billions of neurons, all interconnected, communicating with each other through these complex patterns of signals.
So it's a much more distributed, dynamic view of representation, right? It's not about having one specific neuron for cat, but a pattern of activation across a whole network.
Exactly. The meaning is embedded in the network itself, not in individual symbols. And these networks can learn and adapt based on experience by strengthening or weakening connections between those nodes. Think about how you learn to recognize a new face. It takes time, but the more you see it, the stronger those connections become.
So learning is about changing the strength of connections in the network. That's a cool way to think about it.
And connectionist models have been pretty successful at simulating a wide range of cognitive processes. We're talking perception, language, memory, even problem solving.
It sounds like connectionism offers a really interesting alternative to those traditional symbolic approaches to representation.
It does, and it highlights the fact that cognitive science is still a young field, constantly evolving. There are many different perspectives and approaches. There isn't one right way to understand the mind.
It's like we're looking at the mind through different lenses, each revealing a different facet of its complexity.
Exactly, and as we continue to explore all these perspectives, I'm sure we'll gain even deeper, more profound insights into the human mind.
This has been an incredible journey so far. We've gone from the history of cognitive science to the different types of mental representations. And I can't wait to dive even deeper.
There's so much more to explore. We've laid a solid foundation, and now we can tackle those really big questions about the mind.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready for more.
Before we get to those big questions, those big mysteries, it's worth circling back to those criticisms we touched on earlier. Cognitive science, it's come a long way since its early days, and a lot of those criticisms, well, they've pushed researchers to think more broadly, to consider different perspectives.
So it's not all just cold, hard calculations and algorithms anymore, like we were talking about. Those ideas of emotions and the mind being embodied, those are part of the picture now.
Exactly. They're not just afterthoughts anymore. They're central to how we understand the mind. Want to dive a little deeper into those?
Let's do it. Let's go with emotions. For a long time, they were kind of seen as the enemy of rational thought, right? Like these messy things that just get in the way. How are researchers incorporating emotions into their understanding of how the mind works?
It's a great question. We're starting to realize that emotions, they're not the enemy. They're actually crucial to how we think and make decisions. They're not just these random feelings that pop up. They give us really valuable information about the world, help us navigate difficult situations.
So instead of thinking of emotions as getting in the way, we should think of them as guides, like helpful feedback that informs our actions.
Precisely. Take fear, for instance. Fear, it alerts us to danger, right? It helps us avoid things that could harm us. Joy, on the other hand, it motivates us. It pushes us towards things that are good for us. And sadness, well, sadness helps us process loss.
It's like emotions are constantly giving us these little nudges, these signals, helping us understand the world and react accordingly.
That's a great way to put it. And researchers are starting to map this out, understand the actual neural mechanisms underlying these emotional responses. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala. It plays a key role in processing fear.
Wow, so emotions aren't just mental, they have a real physical basis in the brain.
Absolutely. They're not just these ethereal things floating around. And I think as cognitive science keeps evolving, we're going to see even more sophisticated models that really account for this complex interplay between emotions and thoughts.
This is making me completely rethink my whole understanding of how my mind works. Okay, so we've got emotions, but what about that idea of the mind being embodied? How has that shifted our understanding of cognition?
Well, that traditional view, the mind as this sort of disembodied computer, it's really being challenged by what we call embodied cognition.
Okay, so remind me, what does embodied cognition mean? It's about how our bodies and the world around us shape our thinking.
Exactly. It's not just what's going on inside our heads. Our bodies are actively involved in the process of thinking. Think about how you use your hands when you're trying to explain something complicated, or how your sense of balance, your spatial awareness, affects how you move through a crowded room.
It's like our bodies are participating in the thought process, not just housing our minds.
Exactly. And this idea, it goes beyond our physical bodies. It extends to the tools and technologies we use. A smartphone, it can practically become an extension of our memory, right? Or a GPS, it can change how we think about space and navigation.
So our minds are constantly interacting with the world around us, and that shapes how we think, how we understand things.
It's a two-way street. The mind doesn't just send commands to the body. It's a dynamic back and forth between the mind, the body, and the environment. It's all interconnected.
It's amazing how cognitive science is constantly evolving, incorporating all these new ideas. But before we go too far, can we rewind a bit? I'd love to unpack those mental representations we were talking about earlier.
Sure, mental representations, they're like the fundamental building blocks of thought, those internal symbols, these structures that allow us to make sense of the world around us.
So they're kind of like the language of the mind, right? The way our minds represent and organize information.
You could say that, just like spoken language, written language, mental representations, they use all sorts of different formats to capture information, to represent relationship.
Give me some examples. I'm curious about the different flavors of these mental representations.
Okay, so one type is propositional representations. Imagine them like sentences in your head that express facts or beliefs. So the proposition, the sky is blue, that represents your belief about the color of the sky.
So it's like our minds are always churning out these internal sentences, describing the world as we experience it.
Exactly. And we can combine those propositions, manipulate them to form more complex thoughts, make inferences.
So propositions are one tool in the mental toolkit. What else do we have?
Well, we've got rules. Rules are like if-then statements, connections between concepts or actions. Like, if it's raining, then I'll grab my umbrella. That links the concept of rain to the action of taking an umbrella.
So rules help us make decisions, kind of anticipate what's coming next. They give us a plan.
Precisely. Rules provide a structure for reasoning, for solving problems. And then we have concepts, those mental categories that group similar things together. Instead of remembering every single dog you've ever seen, you have this concept of dog that captures the essential features of dogs in general.
So concepts are like mental shortcuts, helping us make sense of the world more efficiently.
Exactly. And concepts aren't just floating around randomly, they're organized. For example, dog is probably linked to mammal, which is linked to animal.
It's a whole hierarchy of concepts, right? Like a branching tree of related ideas.
Exactly. And these connections between concepts are so important. They help us do all sorts of things like retrieve information, make inferences, and understand those really complex ideas. And then there are images.
Images, those are the easy ones, like mental pictures we see in our mind's eye.
Precisely. Close your eyes and picture your childhood home. You're creating a mental image. And the cool thing is, research suggests we can manipulate these images, almost like we're playing with real objects.
It's like having a VR system built right into our brains.
It really is. We can rotate those mental images, we can zoom in on details, see things from different angles, and that ability is crucial for problem solving, for creativity, you name it.
Okay, we got propositions, rules, concepts, images. This is an impressive mental toolkit. Anything else?
Of course, we can't forget about analogies. Analogies, they're powerful. They allow us to make sense of new situations by comparing them to things we already know.
I love a good analogy. It's like saying, hey, this new thing, it's kind of like this other thing you're already familiar with.
Exactly. Trying to understand the structure of an atom, think of the solar system.
The nucleus is the sun, and the electrons are the planets orbiting around it. I remember that from science class.
See, analogies are great for bridging that gap between the known and the unknown. They provide a framework, to understand these complex ideas.
Like using a familiar map to navigate new territory.
Precisely. And we use analogies all the time in problem solving, decision making, communication, even creativity. They're everywhere.
So our minds are constantly churning, building, and manipulating these representations, weaving them together to create our thoughts, our beliefs, our understanding of the world. It's incredible.
It really is. And as cognitive science digs deeper into the nature of these mental representations, we're gaining even more profound insights into the human mind. But there's one more perspective we need to touch on: connectionism.
Connectionism? All right, hit me with it. What is connectionism all about?
Connectionism, it's a bit different. It challenges that idea that mental representations are just individual symbols stored in our minds.
So it's not about isolated bits of information. It's about how those bits are connected, like a web or a network.
You're getting it. Connectionism emphasizes the importance of interconnected networks in cognitive processing. It's about the relationships, the connections.
So instead of having a specific neuron that represents cat, it's more about a pattern of activation across a whole network of neurons. Is that right?
Exactly. The meaning is embedded in the network itself, not just in individual symbols. And the amazing thing is, these networks can learn, they can adapt through experience by strengthening or weakening connections between those nodes. Think about learning to recognize a new face. It takes time, but those connections become stronger the more you see it.
So learning is about changing the strengths of those connections in the network.
That's a great way to put it. And these connectionist models, they've been pretty successful at simulating all sorts of cognitive processes, from how we perceive things to how we use language, how we remember, how we solve problems.
Connectionism sounds like a really powerful way to think about the mind. It feels very different from the traditional symbolic view.
It is, and it just shows that cognitive science is always evolving. It's a young field full of different perspectives, different approaches. There isn't just one right way to understand the mind.
It's like we're looking at the mind through a kaleidoscope, each turn revealing a different pattern, a different insight.
I love that analogy. And as we keep exploring all these different perspectives, I think we'll just continue to get deeper and deeper, more profound insights into what it means to be human, how our minds make us who we are.
This has been an amazing journey so far. We've covered so much ground, but I know there's still more to come.
Oh, there is. Now that we have a good foundation, we can start tackling those really big questions about the mind, the questions that have fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries.
I can't wait. Let's get to it. All right. So we've talked about these mental representations, the building blocks of thought. But how do they all work together, to create something bigger, something more meaningful? It can't just be a jumble of concepts and images, right?
Right. It's not just a random collection. It's more like, imagine your log as this vast network, right? A network of interconnected nodes. Each node is like a concept, an idea, a piece of information. And the connections between them, well, those represent the relationships. Some connections are stronger, some are weaker, depending on how closely related those ideas are in your mind.
So it's like one of those mind maps people use, but on a much grander scale, like the ultimate mind map.
Exactly. And just like a mind map, it's dynamic, constantly changing. Every time you learn something new, your mind tries to integrate it into this network. It looks for connections to what you already know. It strengthens those connections, forms new ones.
That makes learning sound much more active than just passively soaking up information. Like your mind is actively making connections, building those relationships.
It absolutely is. The more interconnected a concept becomes, the easier it is to access it, to use it in different situations. Think about experts in a field, right? They can recall so much information, apply it so effectively because their mental networks are so densely interconnected within that domain.
It's like having this incredibly well-organized library in your mind. You know exactly where to find the book you need when you need it.
I love that analogy. But it's not just about storage, this network. It's also the engine of our reasoning, how we solve problems. When you're faced with a problem, your mind activates the relevant parts of this network, looking for connections, for patterns that might lead to a solution.
My mind is basically running simulations, trying different pathways through this network, seeing where they lead.
Exactly. And the more interconnected your network and more flexible you are, the more creative you're thinking. You can connect seemingly unrelated ideas, see analogies, come up with those aha solutions that come out of nowhere.
This is making me realize just how complex even our simplest thoughts really are.
It's true. And as cognitive science digs deeper into these mental network, I think we're going to understand even more about the power of the human mind, its ability to learn and adapt and create. But of course, there's still so much we don't know.
That's what I was thinking. We've covered so much ground, but there are still those big looming questions. What are some of the big mysteries that cognitive science is still wrestling with?
Well, one of the biggest is consciousness, right? We know our thoughts and feelings, they come from the brain, that physical activity in our brains. But the question is, how? How does something as intangible as subjective experience, how does that arise from the material stuff of neurons?
That's the mind-body problem, right? That age-old question. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It's a tough one, but cognitive science, it's making progress. By studying the neural correlates of consciousness, basically looking at the brain activity that corresponds to different experiences, researchers are starting to piece it together.
So it's like creating a map of consciousness, figuring out what neural patterns correspond to what experiences.
Precisely. And this is opening up all sorts of new questions. What are the neural signatures of different states of consciousness, like when we're sleeping or dreaming? What makes conscious processing different from unconscious processing? And the really big one, can we create artificial systems that are actually conscious?
Wow, those are some mind-bending questions.
They are. And another big question, closely related to consciousness, is intelligence. What does it even mean to be intelligent? Is it about solving problems, learning, adapting? Is there something more to it?
It seems like with AI developing so rapidly, that question is becoming even more urgent.
Absolutely. As AI systems become more sophisticated, we have to re-examine our own definitions of intelligence. Are there things that humans can do that AI will never be able to replicate? What sets us apart?
It's almost like AI is holding up a mirror, forcing us to look at our own minds, to understand what makes us uniquely human.
Exactly. And this challenge, it's pushing cognitive science to develop new ways of thinking about intelligence, how to measure it, how to understand it. It's not just about how much you know, it's about how you learn, how you adapt, how you apply that knowledge in creative ways.
So this whole deep dive, it's been more than just learning about how our minds work. It's about appreciating the mysteries, realizing how much more there is to discover.
It's a journey, right? A journey of discovery that never really ends. The more we learn about the why, the more we realize how much we don't know. But that's what makes it so exciting. There's always something new to explore.
Couldn't agree more. This has been an incredible journey into the world of cognitive science. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully this has piqued your curiosity, sparked some new ideas. If you're eager to learn more, keep exploring. There's a wealth of information out there, fascinating research, thought-provoking theories, and who knows, maybe you'll make some discoveries of your own along the way. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the amazing world of cognitive science.